Hi, everyone. Welcome to tonight's webinar. It's really wonderful to have you here. My name's McKenzie. I'm the CEO of the Climate Council. And as you know, in May, the Australian people sent a clear message to the new Parliament calling for bold action on climate change. And that was after a decade of abject failure from the previous government to reduce emissions, to invest in solutions or prepare Australians for worsening disasters. And of course, as you know, the task today to tackle the climate challenge is absolutely immense. The climate crisis is with us now, as the Black Summer fires and the recent catastrophic flooding shows. But at the same time, the economics in Australia are boundless. We're the sunniest country in the world, we're one of the windiest, and we have huge reserves of the metals that are critical for the global clean energy revolution. So it's in that context that the new Climate and Energy Minister, Chris Bowen, joins us tonight, and I'll introduce him in just a moment. But first, I want to acknowledge that we're meeting you tonight from the land of the Wurundjeri people, or I'm meeting you from the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I wish to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge any other First Nations people who are on the call with us tonight. There are many First Nations people that are leading the charge to tackle climate change, including protecting country and trying to prevent fossil fuel expansion. And I wanted to acknowledge the work of Original Power, Seed Mob, Save Our Songlines, and so many other amazing First Nations organisations. And I know there are people here from around Australia, so please pop in the area in the country that you're coming from in the chat. Now, Chris Bowen probably needs almost no introduction. You would have seen him very frequently in the media recently, particularly since the election, including for the passing of the climate bill through the lower house, which enshrined an emissions reduction target of 43% by 2030. And tonight we'll start with Chris providing a 5-minute overview of the key areas that he is focused on. And then I will ask a whole bunch of questions. There's been hundreds that have been coming in, and I know you'll be putting more in the chat as well. So we'll try and stay across as many of those as we can. And Chris will try and keep the responses relatively brief, and we'll get through as many as we can. And I know there are potentially some questions for me about the Climate Council's role in this new environment. So at the end, I'll just briefly address that before we finish at 7:45. So Chris, I'll hand over to you now. Thank you so much for making the time to be with us tonight. And we'd love to hear a little bit about how you've started engaging with the climate crisis since coming into this position so recently.
Well, thanks very much, Amanda, and thanks for organising tonight, and thanks for your leadership and the Climate Council's a very active role in this debate. The Climate Council and you are very important, I think, participants and partners, and we'll have areas of 100% agreement, we'll have areas of some different perspectives, but that's okay, because a mature, sensible discussion about the most important crisis facing our country and our globe is one that we should have, and you are very, very important participants in it. I also want to acknowledge the fact that I'm joining you from my home in the Gadigal people of the Darug Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And of course, while noting the importance of pursuing a constitutionally enshrined voice to the Australian Parliament, also note that last week the Energy Ministers unanimously agreed to develop and co-design with our First Nations people a First Nations energy strategy. And also note that one of my first visits as Climate Change Minister was to the Torres Strait to see firsthand what some of our fellow citizens are dealing with today in terms of climate change. Well, look, Amanda, I agreed that I'd keep my remarks to 5 minutes to talk about how the government started, and I'll do my best to do that, but there's a lot of things we could cover. Of course, this has been a very central part of the new government's approach. We passed our climate bill through the House of Representatives, 89 votes to 55, which was a very good, solid result. And I'm very confident it'll pass the Senate. The main importance of that is that it sends a signal to renewable energy investors and transmission investors and storage investors around the world that Australia has a stable policy environment, and we're going to need massive loads of investment for the task we have of getting to 82% renewables by 2030. It's a massive task. We're going to need a lot of private sector investment. We're going to need that investment in storage as well, which is probably the key unfinished piece of the puzzle, as well as transmission, which I can talk about later. And that's a very big task, and we need that stable policy environment. And that's what the legislation is about. It's not so much what it obliges government to do, although there are obligations on me and the government and the Minister of the Day, as there should be, but it's mainly about that stability and certainty. We've done a number of other things. As I mentioned, our energy ministers met last week, and I must say that it continues to be a very solid spirit of cooperation around that table from the nation's energy ministers, recognising the task we have, and it is a very big one, and we do need to be working together. The most important thing I think we did is agree to have the national energy objectives include an emissions reduction element. And that's important because, as everybody on this call knows, electricity generation is our largest source of emissions. And if the regulators and market operators, all three of them, aren't considering emissions reduction as much as they'd like to, but they can't under law, it's a pretty silly situation. The states and territories that have been there for some time, but the Commonwealth kept vetoing it. That veto got lifted last week, and we got on with the job of putting emissions reduction in as a national energy objective. That'll go to the South Australian Parliament and then flow to all the other jurisdictions, and it'll become the national energy objective. So that's important. We've done a whole bunch of other things as well. We've improved the sulphur standards in petrol. I've announced a very significant and important review into carbon credits, the ACCU market. I want the carbon credit market functioning well, but I want it to be credible and legitimate. And I really have a blank canvas when it comes to this. I deliberately have not formed a view because I want the review to do its job. And if I say so myself, I don't think we could have got a better set of independent, unimpeachable reviewers. Professor Ian Chubb, former chief scientist, Dr. the Honourable Justice Annabel Bennett, ACQC, Ariadne Goring, and Dr. Stephen Hatfield Dodds. I mean, this is a top-notch review panel to make sure that our ACCU market is working and we have integrity, and it is real emissions reduction and real abatement. It can't be nonsense. It's got to be real. ACCUs will play an increasingly important role as we get to net zero, but it's got to be real. And I'm very confident that the panel will make sure that it is, and will instill that confidence in the market, and that I can have the confidence and we can all have the confidence. But of course, despite all that, and there's many other things I could have mentioned. I mean, we've notified the COP of our 43% target, of course. We've done a lot of other things, but this is just the beginning. We've got a lot more to do. Tomorrow, I'll be releasing a discussion paper about some of the finer elements of our safeguards mechanism. Safeguards is really important. It's pretty arcane policy, but it's really important stuff. You know, you're not going to reduce emissions in Australia unless you reduce them from our 215 biggest emitters. This is 28% of our emissions covered by these 200 odd sites, and they've got to be getting emissions down. And we want to work with them. And it's actually, as I said on TV on the weekend, it's actually important for them because increasingly competitiveness will equal zero carbon, increasingly already. The more you're decarbonising, the more competitive you are. And this will provide a framework for that to happen. There's some fine details, and you'll see in the paper I put out tomorrow, it's quite detailed esoteric policy matters, but they're really important in getting it right. And I know the Climate Council will put in a submission. I want everybody putting in submissions. I'll be reading them all because we've got to get this right. We've got to ensure competitiveness. We don't want to see emissions simply transfer overseas, but we've got to see real emissions reduction. And the design is really important. And some of the questions that we're posing in that paper are really important. And I know I'll get good feedback. Rewiring the nation is very important. Of course, when there's no transition without transmission, and we've got to get 10,000 kilometres of transmission lines built to get the renewable energy, and it's spread around the country. Unlike for right or for wrong, and for what it got gas and coal, there's one thing you can say about them: they're centrally located in one place, or in a small group of places around the country. So the transmission grid has been built around them. Now we've got to build a transmission grid which can get renewable energy from wherever it's generated, solar farms and wind farms right across the country. And we're getting on with that, and there's good negotiations with the states and with transmission companies about getting that done. But also last week we agreed to declare some transmission lines national significant, and that actually is to bring communities with us and enable us to get a better communication process, better compensation, because there is a social licence issue, and communities really deserve to be brought with us. There's one final matter I'll just touch on before opening up for the conversation. That is our progress on offshore wind. Again, there's much more to do, but I've declared the 6 zones. Actually, I've declared 1 zone officially, and I've flagged the other 5 to follow. The first is Gippsland, for which we've opened up the 60 days of necessary consultation. I've indicated that the Hunter will be next I've indicated then that there are others to follow, 4 others to follow, and that's really important. This is energy rich and it's jobs rich, which is really, I'm sure we'll talk about jobs later. But if you take, for example, I was at Tomago Aluminium Smelter during the week. They're really excited about offshore wind because it is part of their transfer to renewable energy. You know, we might want to criticise Tomago. Some people might. Tomago is New South Wales' biggest energy user. I'm not going to criticise them because they want to transfer to renewable energy, but it's really hard. A big offshore wind farm will help them do that. And Portland Aluminium Smelter is also very dedicated to offshore wind, and they're very excited about our plans. But there's more to do. We actually got designating the zones. Me signing a piece of paper is just the very first step. We've actually got things built and generating power and generating jobs, and they will. But Amanda, I'll leave it there. I'm more than happy to have a good discussion. Again, there'll be areas where we agree, areas where we disagree, but I'll always be keen for a good, honest, respectful conversation on these important challenges. And it's such an honour to be given this job and to be starting to make up the ground for 10 years of denial and delay that we're catching up from.
Thank you. That gives us a really clear sense of your agenda, and it was a lot to get through in a few minutes. And I think what's really buoyed us is just how quickly you've taken to it and started progressing so many different components of it. I wanted to start with the climate bill. It was an important step forward, and we were really pleased to see that the target was included as a floor rather than a ceiling, and that ambition can be ratcheted over time. I wanted to go to the Climate Authority because the bill puts the Climate Authority front and centre on providing advice, and the previous government decimated the funding for climate science in general and generally ignored advice and credible climate information. How do you plan to restore credibility to the Climate Change Authority and bring climate science and evidence back to guiding Australia's climate response?
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. I mean, the Climate Change Authority is really important, but you're right, it has been gutted. It currently has, I think, 9 staff, 8 or 9 staff. I've met them all. Yes, there's so few of them that I've walked in and said hello to them all. And you consider they're meant to be the authority guiding government. And of course, the previous government sent its revised NDC to Glasgow and didn't bother telling the Climate Change Authority, not let alone asking them. So they do need to be restored. We'll have more to say about that in the budget because they're funded by government. So therefore, the budget will be the mechanism by which we make sure that they have enough resources to do their job. That'll take some time to ramp them up. You know, you don't go from 0 to hero overnight in terms of 8 staff and then a lot more, but they will get a good boost and they will be important. There are some vacancies on the board which I will be filling soon, and I'll be filling them in a way which I think people will see that, you know, we're very serious about the role for the Climate Change Authority to take and the importance of their role. So again, we've written into the bill some important protections. The Climate Change Authority's advice to me or the Minister today will be made public automatically. It'll be tabled in Parliament, must be tabled in Parliament by the Minister of the day, so there's no running from it. Governments will make decisions. Cabinets have to make decisions. We're the ones with our names on the ballot paper accountable to people. So I'll be taking a recommendation, for example, for our 2035 target to the Cabinet. But it'll be one I say, here's the Climate Change Authority's advice, here's what I think we should do. And if it's differing from the Climate Change Authority's advice, I've got to explain and show people why. It's an important transparency, and that's exactly what will happen.
Thank you. The next question comes again, thinking about the bill and how you get long-term robust action, because obviously the previous government dismantled a number of different policies and programs to tackle climate change. David Carr brought this up in the chat, talking about how do you get that robustness over time, and you've been bringing people together around the climate bill. What do you think are the key factors to build that broad and enduring coalition of support for climate action in the Parliament and beyond the Parliament?
I think, Amanda, to be very brutally frank, the answer is to make it very clear that it is in our national interest to act on climate change. Yes, it's an obligation. It's an obligation to the rest of the world. It's an obligation to future generations. If you believe that, and if you're on this call, you probably do, and you do, and I do. But we're not the ones who have to convince. We have, and nor to be clear, are we trying to convince people who deny climate science, because we're not going to convince them. You know, if they aren't convinced yet, they're not going to be convinced. The people we need to convince are the people who believe in the science of climate, But frankly, it's not their top 1, 2 or 3 issues. Unlike, us, they're trying to get food on the table. They're trying to work out where they're working 2 or 3 jobs, et cetera, et cetera. They've got to be convinced that action on climate change is good for our country, and therefore it's good for our economy. So hence, when we were writing Powering Australia from Opposition, we took the decision to commission economic modelling to work out its impact on the economy, because we were very confident it would be an economic positive, an economic plus, but we needed to have the evidence to show people. So it creates 604,000 jobs, billions of dollars of investment, and of course renewable energy is the cheapest form of energy, so it puts downward pressure on prices. So all that is true, but we need to make that case constantly. So, yeah. and frankly too, there's a case, we have to talk about the risk, the downside, the bad things that will happen if we don't address climate change. Yes, that's legitimate, we have to. But we also have to talk about opportunities, because people don't want to hear bad news all the time. They want enough doom and gloom coming at them all the time. If you just say, look, everything's terrible, going to be terrible, going to get worse, that's important, but it's not enough. We have to show the positives, the opportunities. Renewable energy, offshore wind farms, which I've talked about a bit. Very energy rich, great for climate change, very jobs rich. Creates thousands of jobs because it's so windy off our coast, because ships need to take the maintenance workers out. So there's lots of jobs very closely linked to the regions. We've got to bring all people together with us. So I make no, but I was in the Hunter this week. I was talking to coal mining companies, talking to renewable energy companies, talking to companies working on really cutting edge technology to store renewable energy. We've got to bring everyone with us as much as we can. And that means really painting it as in our national interest, which, by the way, of course it is. I haven't even touched on national security while it's in our national interest as well.
Yeah, thank you. It's interesting. Maybe the silver lining of so much being so far behind is now there's so many good examples internationally as well of how things, like the offshore wind example, for instance, we took some journalists to the UK a few years ago to show them just how amazing these facilities can be and how many jobs, etc. there are. It is a really good news story. I wanted to move us next. The Climate Council, as you know, has been vocal about needing stronger targets over time. I don't really want to get into targets. I think we definitely have had a good start now that that target is legislated. But just in terms of the scaling ambition over time, and what it takes to really cut emissions deeply this decade. I wanted to talk about the new coal and gas projects. This is obviously shaping up to be one of the fights during this term. And in terms of the questions we received in advance, was the sort of lion's share were around the issues of coal and gas, particularly new coal and gas. And as you know, expert bodies like the International Energy Agency has said we can't open any new coal or gas projects and still have a chance of meeting the Paris Agreement. You've said on a number of occasions that the government wouldn't stand in the way of projects if they stacked up environmentally and financially. But thinking about some of those really big projects like Beetaloo and Scarborough that are described as carbon bombs, how could those projects ever stack up environmentally?
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. It's a very important question, and I'm more than happy to deal with it. But I will just take a moment to start with by sort of just setting the scene a little bit by saying coal and gas is easier to say, but every project is of course different. A coal-fired power station, which won't happen in Australia, not while we're in office, that's quite different to extracting gas for an existing gas-fired power station, for example. So I completely understand your question, and I completely get the importance of the issue. In terms of new projects, some people say there's hundreds of new projects that the Labor Party supports, to be frank. That's not right. There aren't hundreds of new projects. Because there's a list of projects which companies have registered that they might one day want to develop does not mean that the hundreds of new projects, on the doorstep waiting that the Labor Party supports. That's quite wrong. In terms of your question about how something stacks up environmentally and financially, well, firstly, it's got to stack up for the board. They've got to be confident that in a decarbonising world, there's demand. That's increasingly challenging. Even though coal prices are high at the moment because of geopolitical circumstances, a board's making an investment decision for decades. When 80% of our trading partners are committed to net zero, boards have got to be pretty clear about, it's stacking up financially and not becoming a stranded asset. They've got to get finance. Again, I was with a bank chairman today and he was talking about their bank's financing views of fossil fuels. And I said, it's your obligation to work in the best interest of your consumers and of your shareholders. That's your job, to act in the best interest of your shareholders. And I knew what his response would be. He said, well, our shareholders won't want us to finance fossil fuel that might become a stranded asset, because that's the boards and the shareholders actually acting in their own best interest, but ending in a way which financing is not as easy as it once was. And then environmentally, look, obviously my friend and colleague Tanya Plibersek holds the pen on environmental approvals, and states do, but she last week, or the week before perhaps, began the process of the first rejection of a coal mine in EPBC history. Now, I'm not going to comment on that in any detail because there's a very delicate legal process. And again, we have to remember that, public commentaries, and perhaps I need to remember it more than you do, Amanda, because I'm a cabinet member, and my comments can be raised in courts of law to challenge decisions. But, I think Tanya has shown the sorts of things that can be done with a diligent environment minister. She's also going through the process of rewriting the EPBC Act in response to the Samuel Review. She's got a lot more to say about that, etc. So there's more to be done there. But I think that the question is, how could anything stack up environmentally and financially? Well, there's big hurdles now financially, and frankly, there's hurdles environmentally.
Thank you. And in terms of the EPBC Act, many of our members would have seen that we sent an open letter to Minister Tanya Plibersek arguing the need to reform the EPBC Act to include a climate trigger, because that project obviously didn't stack up environmentally, but it wasn't. The climate wasn't the issue, it was the reef. So we've been arguing that. I know you probably don't want to get into the detail of the EPBC Act, given that's Tanya's territory. We just wanted to ask you then about public money for new coal and gas. You've said there'd be no government finance for new coal or gas fields. Tom put through the question saying, during the last budget, Barnaby Joyce announced $2 billion for infrastructure at Darwin Harbour for a new fossil fuel precinct, and ministers in the current government have recommitted to that money. Where there are projects like that have been initiated by the previous government, would your government look at making sure a precinct like that was just for clean energy, and that federal money does not support fossil fuel expansion when it's been committed in the past?
Well, what we will do is go through, and what we are doing, I'm doing and my colleagues are doing, is going through every single commitment of the previous government with a fine-tooth comb, and you'll see our response in the budget. And that's as you would expect, and that's what a good government would do. So where a project was announced by the previous government but not contracted, i.e. no contract was signed, then we reserve the right to basically, as a new government, make our own decisions. And we're going through that process now. Now, that means there is a process. I'm not in a position to announce this is in and this is out because there's a budget to be brought down. But certainly we'll also be looking at, to the question directly, yeah, sure, we'll be looking at not just as a project proceed or not proceed, but how it could be done better or differently. So bit to go there. Our principles are very clear. And I've said what I've said about government financing, and that remains the position. But there you go. That's there's a budget to go yet, and a considerable amount of work going on.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And I'll move us away from fossil fuels now. There's more questions coming through. We'll come back to it again if we have time. In terms of transport, we know that decarbonising the transport sector is a big part of the puzzle, and you've talked about an EV strategy. We've got a number of questions coming through about the fact that Australia has some of the dirtiest and most polluting cars in the developed world, and that new car standards in other places around the world are commonplace, like the US and Europe. New cars can stay on the road for 15 to 20 years, which underpins how important it is to get it right. It would have been nice 10 years ago, but now's the next best time. Samantha asks, what can we achieve by 2030 on electric vehicles? What should the ambition be?
Well, we need to be doing a lot better, and there's a lot of catching up to do. So I'm very passionate about electric cars. I drive one, the best car I've ever driven, and I'm very passionate about them. So what have we announced and done so far? Just to recap, because sometimes it's easy to forget what we have done. We've passed through the House of Representatives our electric car tax cut. So that will abolish the fringe benefits tax, and through a separate mechanism, will abolish the tariff on electric cars below the luxury car tax threshold, because I think the key issue is affordable electric vehicles. We need to get more at the lower end, frankly, the lower cost end. This is what we've done already, passed it through the House of Representatives. I'm very confident it'll pass the Senate as well when it gets there. That's an early action. We've also announced we will convert the Commonwealth fleet to electric or hydrogen, with 75% of purchases being zero emissions by 2025. That's important because we're a big fleet, and actually I don't think I know that will get the attention of manufacturers, because we have 10,000 cars in the Commonwealth fleet. We turn them over, once every 3 years. The Commonwealth keeps its cars for 3 years, so that's a big incentive for manufacturers to send more here. We've also announced that we will install a charger once every 150 k's, a fast charger on the national highway, on the highway network, to deal with range anxiety. Because, as I sometimes joke, Australians drive long distances, or even if we don't, we like to think we do, or we might say. Everybody loves the idea of driving to Sydney to Perth. Not sure many people will, but people like the idea of it. So range anxiety is an issue. So we'll install those chargers. This is a sea change on the previous government. Just an absolute sea change on their approach. I have said that, to get directly to your question, emission standards for new cars, that is on the table. I do recognise that 85% of cars sold around the world deal in a regime of emission standards. I'll be having more to say in due course about the way forward, but obviously we want to ensure choice for Australians, and we are currently, frankly, bit of a dumping ground for manufacturers who don't have to comply with various standards. But that's what we've done so far, and there's an ongoing conversation. We'll have an electric vehicle strategy, and that will be a good piece of work.
Yeah, and I know that the Electric Vehicle Council is having their summit at the end of the week, and they've certainly been arguing that transport should be playing a big part in the 43% reduction target. Do you think that in terms of each different sector that you will apply the 43% reduction across each, or are you anticipating that transport would be doing that much heavy lifting, or somewhat less?
Well, I mean, the 43% is economy-wide. We're not going to be 43% in each sector. Some will be more and some will be less. That's just the nature of things. But I want transport playing a good contribution. It's 11%. In terms of passenger vehicles at the moment. There's a lot more to do. I think, look, the good news is we've eked up against all the odds, against government policy. Australians have just edged up electric vehicle sales from 0.7 to 2. Doesn't seem like much because it isn't much, but it's something.
Yeah.
And actually, there's a fair bit of evidence around the world that when you get to 5%, that's when it takes off. Now, because people see electric vehicles, your neighbour drives one, and you hop in one for a test drive. You think, this is great. And you stop at the lights, and an electric vehicle beats you off the lights. You think, actually, they do go. And and then you start to get the second-hand market. That's the other thing about the Commonwealth fleet. Because we sell our cars every 3 years, we'll have an electric vehicle second-hand market in 3 years' time, because the Commonwealth, because at the moment you can't effectively, if you want a second-hand EV, good luck. They'll settle out in seconds. So there's a lot more to do, but I think that really this starting to bring it together is what's the key. And there's some signs of hope there that once you get to 5%, it can very quickly take off. I think Sweden was at 18% and then got to 64% in 2 years. Can we do that? Well, let's hope so.
Yeah, and I think, as you said, we're coming off a very low base, but I drive an electric car. I can't tell you how many times I get stopped with people asking me about it, particularly young men, or just men in general, actually. Lots of young kids, older men.
I've noticed that too. I drive my car past, school pickup or something, and the kids are turning and looking, pointing. I think that's a great thing. They're interested.
It is. There's a lot of enthusiasm, but as you said, we've been a dumping ground for polluting cars for a long time, and the supply issues will be there. So this policy settings, getting that right, so important. I'll just move on to electricity. As you said earlier, the modelling that you've released shows that renewable energy would grow to 82% by 2030, which is fantastic. We'd argue we should go even more, but that's definitely a really welcome change from where you've been.
82 is a big jump, Amanda.
It is.
Big jump from where it's going to be hard work to get there. I'd love to do better, but that's a big jump.
You're in the hard position that you're coming off such a low base, so everything that you do is such a big achievement. But then on the other hand, we've got so far to go. So it's a challenging spot to be in, and I'm conscious of that when I ask these questions. But wanted to bring you to storage. A Victorian Energy Policy Centre stated that there's a real risk of under-provision for storage through the existing mechanisms. And Chris Waring sent in a question that went something along the lines of Australia needs an energy storage target like the renewable energy target that we've had in the past. Do you think we need some sort of legislated target to bring on sufficient storage to support that 82% renewables?
Well, I 100% agree that that's the important challenge.
Mm-hmm.
I more than 100% agree with that. That is the unfinished piece of the business, unfinished piece of the puzzle, if you like, because we know how to build renewables. We're doing it. And again, against the odds, with a federal government that didn't care or was actively opposing, we've been building the renewables. We've got a lot more to do. And rewiring the nation, building the transmission will bring on a lot more renewables. We've got some congestion issues to work through. But the renewables will be built and will be built faster. Transmission will get on and build, but storage is the hard bit because we are pumping a lot of solar in during the day. Huge amounts of solar being pumped in during the day, and we're not storing it as well as we should for evening peaks. So we're going to have household batteries, grid scale batteries, community batteries. We've got a policy of 400 community batteries, as you know. Mm-hmm. And we'll get on and do that. But we're going to need pumped hydro and we're going to need hydrogen. Now, in terms of design, last week, the energy ministers agreed that we would, if you like, take the pen on what's called the capacity mechanism. Capacity, or what I might call a capacity and firming mechanism, or could be called a capacity firming, the storage mechanism, because anything which introduces dispatchable power is what we need. As the energy minister, I have to be honest with you and tell you, this crisis we went through recently was real. I mean, I was on the phone to the chief executive of AEMO, the Australian Energy Market Operator, 4 times a day. And on a number of occasions, he said, Minister, I cannot rule out load shedding or blackouts tonight. This was really tight because of 4 gigawatts of capacity come off during the previous government and only 1 gigawatt come on. But a lot of solar's come on. And we need to store it for the evening peak. So this is a big task, and there's lots of things we can do to encourage more storage. The good news is, of course, that wind, despite what Pete Dutton said, who said renewables don't work at night, actually, well, I concede solar, but I don't concede wind. Wind does work at night, particularly offshore wind. Actually, offshore wind is quite counter-cyclical. Well, it actually gets windier off the coast at night. So that's another reason for offshore wind. But look, I don't want to get into design and mechanisms tonight, but do government settings need to encourage more storage? 1,000,000%. Absolutely. And if we can solve the storage problem, we've solved the problem, basically. It's more than batteries. Some people say, batteries means you don't need firming. That's, with respect, just not right. Batteries are short-term. Batteries are hours. They can get you through a peak, usually, hopefully. What they can't get you through, to get nerdy for a moment, is what the Germans call Dunkelflaute. A Dunkelflaute is a long period of cold, non-wind, non-sunny period. We have to assume in Australia that we have 9 days of that. 9 days where it's not sunny, it's not windy, and it's very cold in a row. And we are nowhere near the storage we need for that. We are just not storing enough renewable energy for that. So we need to do a lot more around storage. So regardless of how we design, we need to be encouraging batteries, green hydrogen, which is storage. Like, people talk about green hydrogen, and quite right. But hydrogen is a form of storage. It's not a form of energy. It's how we store something. And we need to be encouraging pumped hydro. We've got Snowy 2.0, but pumped hydro, as hard as it is because there's environmental approvals and big engineering issues, is a big opportunity. Somebody said to me, we've got everything we need for pumped hydro except water and mountains the other day. Right. We need both of those, but, it's got to play a big role.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely. And there's a lot to do in that space, as the other ones that we've described as well. I wanted to switch the conversation now to the big picture. Prime Minister Albanese has indicated he wants Australia to do its fair share globally to cut emissions, and how important that is for our standing in the region. We had a team over at the Pacific Islands Forum, and it was really great to see the reception for Australia doing more. But there certainly will be pressure from the Pacific for us to continue to do, firstly, to implement what we've said that we would do, as you've been describing, and then to take on more ambition after that. Australia's plans to host a COP, if we can, meeting in the next few years. What do you think the government could do to use that as an international platform for progressing the climate agenda, not just domestically, but globally?
So, look, COP is a big deal, and we do want to host one. Most importantly, I want to host it with the Pacific. I can't think of a better opportunity for the Pacific to make their case to the world about why this is important. So that's one of the reasons I'm so passionate about Australia hosting a COP. It sends the signal to the rest of the world Australia's back. The deniers are gone. Glasgow was such an utter embarrassment for our country. Can you consider the sea change from being an embarrassment at Glasgow to actually hosting the COP? I mean, what a change.
Yeah.
But if we host it with the Pacific through some form, which we're still talking to the Pacific about, that's just sends such a powerful message. I guess the other point, Amanda, is to go back to our original question about how you bring people with us. COP is the world's biggest trades fair now. I mean, there's all these export expos, etc. None of them have a candle on COP. And so we've got to show, if we're trying to show Australians that there's jobs in this, there'll be a lot of jobs created by Australia running a successful COP, showing our ability to power the world. Sorry, that's probably a little bit over the top. To export power and become a renewable energy superpower for Southeast Asia at the very least. So when you consider the opportunities we have, Sun Cable, which will be the world's largest solar farm in the Northern Territory, connected to Singapore via a massive submarine cable. They're the sorts of stories we can tell at the COP that we can do to generate renewable energy in Australia and generate jobs.
Yeah, that project is so exciting, isn't it? And it'd be very different to be going to COP, and I've been to a number of COPs feeling quite embarrassed. So it would be quite a different thing as you describe. One final question before I think we've got time for two more questions. The Hawke-Keating government changed Australia for the better because it delivered significant and enduring reforms like Medicare or superannuation. One of our economists, Nikki Hutley, describes the opportunities for Australia as boundless. And you have touched on a range of the opportunities. We haven't had a chance to talk much about jobs, but they're obviously in there as well as the sort of nation building capacity of tackling this crisis. What do you think is the Hawke-Keating size legacy that you could leave Australia on climate change?
This, absolutely. Getting climate change policy right and energy policy right, and the same thing. This is as big an agenda as Hawke-Keating had, but much more focused. And I take a lot of heart and pride, frankly. The answer I've just given you would be the same answer the Prime Minister would give you and the Treasurer would give you. And I can say that because they have. I've seen forums where the Prime Minister's asked, what's going to be the legacy of your government? He says, fixing climate change, getting energy policy right. That is our Hawke-Keating agenda. It's the centerpiece of what we're doing. So I guess really Hawke and Keating, as you've sort of intimated, brought people with them. I mean, these were big changes, big reforms. I was a kid, I grew up with Keating as Treasurer. I was obsessed with watching him on TV as Treasurer when I was a teenager. And now I regard him as a friend and a mentor. But he was bringing people with him as he embarked on this big reform, this big change. And you have to do that. You can't just lecture people that this is what we're going to do. You've got to show the benefits. That's what I'm talking about. We're going to bring people with us on this journey. For too long, Australians have been divided against each other. You know, the previous government, the previous Prime Minister said climate change is an inner city obsession. People in the regions pay the cost. It's always a lie. Never been more a lie than today. We can bring Australians with us and behind this big agenda. And that's why I say that's our equivalent to the Hawke-Keating agenda, is getting this right.
Thank you. And I've had a lot of comments through in the chat, which you probably haven't had a chance, obviously, to see, but I'm sure your staff will have. There's a lot of people saying to me, you know, we need to go further, we need to go faster. We'll have to, there's a lot of enthusiasm for you to ban new coal and gas projects and to phase out fossil fuels more quickly. And as we talked about earlier, the scale of the ambition, as you've just described, to fundamentally change the nation is already a big one. But the climate challenge, because we're very late to the party, is even bigger. So we need to, as you've described, bring the community with us. And I think any government needs the community in making big changes to be coming along. And what we couldn't afford is to backslide like we did 10 years ago when there'd been legislation come through, but the community wasn't adequately brought along. A government came in and unwound it all. We certainly don't have time for that again. So I wondered if you could reflect on, for our community, think it's going to require everyone to have their shoulder to the wheel on this. How do we need to help in moving the community forward as well to support the outcomes that we want, which is stronger and stronger action over time, and to get us there within the parameters that the science demands?
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. I might take that question in two parts if I can, briefly. Firstly, I get it. I completely understand, you know, the passion to do more and be higher. And I'd love to do more than 43. That's why 43 was always a floor, not a ceiling. And that's why we wrote it into the legislation. The Independents suggested it, and I was more than happy to accommodate it because it was always our intention, as was in our original notification to the UNFCCC. But I want to make this point, and I don't mean to really be a dampener, because I hope people realise how passionate I am about this challenge, this opportunity in renewable energy. But I'm also, as the minister responsible, I've got to be realistic. This is hard stuff. We are starting in 2022 to reach a 2030 target, when we should have started in 2013 or 2016 or 2010. You pick your year. 2022 is really late. It's 89 months. And so 43%, I understand people want more, but let me tell you, if we achieve 43%, it will be the biggest economic change post-war in Australia, which we achieve in 89 months. More than Hawke and Keating, as much as I deeply admire and respect the Hawke-Keating legacy, this will be a bigger economic change. And we've got 89 months to do it. Now, you think about a month, it goes pretty quickly. 89 goes pretty quickly too. So we've got a lot of work to do. And that's why I say this is a whole of government effort, but it's a whole of government's effort, and it's a whole of society effort, because it has to be done. And I can't do it. Federal government is the starting point, having a federal government that gets the framework, but it's nowhere near enough. So we've got to do a lot. And just let me tell you, for those people who say 43% is easy, it's going to be hard. We'll do it. We will 100% do it. And I hope we do better. But let's not forget, as I said at a Cricketers for Climate Change function with Pat Cummins recently, he's doing great work. It's like walking out to the middle of the cricket oval in a 50 overs match in the 20th over and saying, right now we'll start to catch up. You've given away the first 3 overs. It's really hard. Now, what can we all do together? Comes back to, let's just keep reminding people, this is good for our country. Yes, it's an obligation. We have to do it. This is good for our country. It's good for our economy. It's good for our national security. We talk about the Pacific. What about Southeast Asia? We live next door to the world's largest archipelago in Indonesia. The implications for them of rising sea levels are massive. Therefore, the implications for us are massive. This is good for Australia to do. We've got to bring it back to that. Or ultimately, acting on climate change. You know, if someone was, China's not doing enough and the rest of the world won't act. If no other country was acting on climate change, if none of them were, it would still be in our national interest to do it. That's what's important.
Thank you so much, Chris. I just love your passion. I can't tell you what a 180-degree turn it is from some of the conversations I've had in recent years with parliamentarians, and it's so refreshing to hear you describe the challenge in that way, and with the passion you have for bringing forward these reforms. I wanted to just quickly address, as we wrap up, a few questions came through for me about the Climate Council's role, and particularly in us articulating the scale of the challenge. I wanted to describe to the community what I see our role as. 3 things: building public support for stronger action, socialising communities. As Chris, you just said, this is a society-wide thing, and we need everyone supporting it, and we see that as being one of our principal roles to help. Secondly, being a constructive catalyst for action from government, providing ideas, providing information, not just to the federal government. We work with state governments, a lot of work with local governments. And thirdly, holding governments to account, pushing them for more in line with the science. So many generous people regularly contribute to the Climate Council, which allow us to do our work, like putting on this webinar, and we'd love you to join them if you have capacity. Chris, I really enjoyed our chat tonight. Thank you so much for making the time. I know how enormously busy you are. Well, I don't think I fully appreciate how enormously busy you are. It must be crazy for you at the moment. But we're here to help you implement positive climate change, and we will push you to go faster and harder where we can. And we really appreciate with your engagement with us tonight, with our experts, with our community. And thank you very much for making the time. And thank you to everyone who has joined the conversation tonight. Really appreciate all your comments and your questions.
Thank you. Thanks, Amanda. Let's go do it. Let's make it a reality.
Yeah, let's go do it. That's a great way to end. Thank you.
Yes.
Have a good night. See you later.